The firestorm over President Trump's racial rhetoric rages on, but during the debate last night, author Marianne Williamson and Senator Elizabeth Warren's comments on racism in America were the third most tweeted moments. Here's some of the debate highlights.
We need to call out white supremacy for what it is, domestic terrorism, and it poses a threat to the United States of America.
I assure you, I lived in Grosse Pointe. What happened in Flint would not have happened in Grosse Pointe. This is part of the dark underbelly of American society. The racism, the bigotry, and the entire conversation that we're having here tonight, if you think any of this wonkiness is going to deal with this dark psychic force of the collectivized hatred that this president is bringing up in this country, then I'm afraid that the Democrats are going to see some very dark days.
MSNBC analyst Zerlina Maxwell joins us now. Zerlina, thanks so much for hanging with us. We've got to ask
Thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you. We've got to ask the most obvious thing. Last night was an all-white debate stage. I mean, how do you even begin to address the issue of race when it is a stage full of only white people?
Well, you know, in fairness to CNN, they did prove, and they showed on live TV, that it was random, so it was unfortunate that the first night ended up being an all-white debate. But in some ways, I think that's a good thing, because white people who are running to be president need to be able to speak about the issue of race in the same level as people of color. Just because you don't experience racism in your daily life does not mean you should not be able to be a leader on those issues. And I think what you saw from Elizabeth Warren, more so than Marianne Williamson, I think people are praising her for that answer, and also her answer about reparations, which was also really solid. But you know, most of her other positions are not Democratic positions. But Elizabeth Warren speaks about racism in a way that's really intersectional. She doesn't just talk about white supremacy. She doesn't just talk about racism. She ties it into the policies that she's proposing. And that's that critical piece that really can gain support among voters of color. So I think it was weird to see a stage full of white candidates on a night when Donald Trump's been spending, you know, week after week attacking Congresspeople of color. But that's just how it shook out.
If you had to give them a report card overall, how would you say they did on the issue of race?
You know, there's a lot to be gained in really hiring a diverse set of people who are informing your messaging and your policies. So I would give Elizabeth Warren an A on race, because again, she tied it to her policies. Overall, I would say I would give the stage a C, though, because I don't think an answer like, for example, from Amy Klobuchar about how not every person who voted for Donald Trump is a racist, and actually they were just concerned about economic anxiety. There are many answers you can give on the question about race and racism. That's actually the wrong answer. There's one wrong answer, and she gave it last night. So I'm hopeful that the candidates will listen to staff members who come from diverse backgrounds so they can be more informed on that question going forward.
So tonight's going to be a completely different story. All the candidates of color will be on the stage tonight. There are 5 of them. Can you talk about the importance of, you know, representation and diversity tonight, and just maybe how you think it might play out a little differently given, you know, the different stage we're going to see?
Well, I think that there's this misperception that people are supporting women or supporting people of color just because they're people of color or because they're women. That is not correct. What is helpful in terms of the inclusiveness and representation shown on the stage in having women and having candidates of color is that they have different lived experiences that then can inform either their level of empathy or understanding around certain policy issues. So, for example, if you're talking about racism as an intellectual exercise and you're saying, I wonder if Donald Trump's racism is a political strategy, and let's talk about whether or not it's working, as a black person, that sounds crazy, because you're actually the target of Donald Trump's racism. And so when you're the target of Donald Trump's racism, it's not a strategy, it's a threat. So I think that, we have to have a more representative slate of candidates. And tonight is going to demonstrate that the Democratic Party is the party, is the big tent party that has candidates of all different backgrounds that can, use their diverse lived experiences to inform how they think about these issues. There's not just one identity. The default identity is not white. And I think for too long in politics, that's normally the frame we've been working under. And I think that that's changing now. And I think that's a good thing.
Anyone you're looking for a big performance from tonight, particularly whether it's on issues of racism or diversity?
I'm actually looking to see what Cory Booker does on stage, because he's been directly challenging Vice President Joe Biden on his criminal justice record, on the fact that he was the architect, in his words, of mass incarceration, because he authored that 1994 crime bill, which, as you know, had so many unfortunate circumstances and impacted communities of color in a very negative way. And so he's getting his first opportunity to be on the stage with Joe Biden to directly challenge him, and I think that that's important. So while most people will be looking at Kamala Harris to see what she's going to do because she was so successful in the first slate of debates, I think there is an opening for Cory Booker to shine, because number one, he was an author and a sponsor of that bipartisan First Step Act, that criminal justice reform package that just passed through and was signed into law by President Trump. So he has, the receipts to show I'm doing the work on these issues. But he was also the mayor of Newark, New Jersey, and I'm from New Jersey. I went to law school in Newark, and so he can speak from a firsthand experience about seeing the consequences of Joe Biden's policies as mayor. And so I think that he can speak from that experience in a really authentic way, and I'm looking for him to actually challenge Vice President Joe Biden, maybe even more so than Kamala Harris, because I don't think that Kamala Harris needs necessarily another huge moment. She just needs to show up, be tough like she always is, and be consistent. It's really Joe Biden that had a lot of people a little nervous after that first debate, so he's going to have to be able to respond to any of these attacks that may come.
Is there something that you think Joe Biden can do to sort of either end this question about, whether he's racist or not, or just effectively respond to it? Because as you mentioned, people were kind of disappointed with his performance the first time around. Is there a smarter strategy or way he can better approach it tonight?
Well, I don't think that anybody has ever argued that Joe Biden is racist, per se, right? I think Kamala was very clear in saying that I'm not calling you a racist, but some of the things you said in the past seem tone deaf. Yep. And let me tell you about my actual experience living through the consequences of your policy, right? And I think that that's an important conversation. I don't think that Joe Biden's a racist, but I think that he needs to first step back, resist the impulse to be defensive, because as a former Hillary staffer, I can tell you that defensiveness on the issue of criminal justice, it doesn't fly with millennials of color, and we need millennials of color to be engaged and to turn out. And so Joe Biden should just not be defensive. Own up to the mistakes in your record. You have a record. It's a long one. You evolved. You've grown. I'm hopeful that he can be honest about his record, but then also, put forward a vision for the future. I also think that the issue of Anita Hill may come up tonight, and I hope that he has a sufficient response for that, because he hasn't apologized even sufficiently enough for Professor Hill's own satisfaction. So I think that that's an issue that still could dog him going forward, and I'm hopeful he has a response to that as well.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.